In the great wolf-shifter kingdom of Ashveil, there was a human maid that no one looked at twice. This was not an accident. She had worked very hard to be forgettable, in a palace where power announced itself in bloodline and rank, and the particular authority of a shifter's scent. A human woman with calloused hands and a quiet voice was easy to overlook. She was hired help, background, part of the architecture, and for 3 years she had survived inside that invisibility, carrying a secret that could get her killed. The kind of knowledge that the palace had once decided belonged only to the dead. She had a plan. It was a careful, sensible plan, and it required only that she keep her eyes down, her hands still, and her true self buried so deep that even the wolves around her, with all their impossible senses, would never catch the scent of what she was. The plan did not account for the pup. He was 3 years old, silver-furred, born with a twisted leg that the court spoke of in whispers, and the king could not bear to think about too long. He was the future of a grieving kingdom, and on a cold autumn morning he was alone at the bottom of a staircase he'd tumbled down, trembling and unable to rise. She found him. She picked him up, and she carried him through the grand corridor in her plain apron, singing a low human lullaby to keep him calm, never knowing that his father was watching from above, never knowing that something in a king's long-silenced heart recognized her in that moment and refused to go quiet again, never knowing that someone else had already decided she needed to be removed before anyone started asking what, exactly, a maid's hands knew. This is the story of what happens when the invisible woman refuses, at the moment that matters most, to disappear. It begins on the morning she stopped walking past a crying child and changed everything. The palace woke before the sun did. That was the first thing Lyra had learned, in the early days when everything about Ashveil still felt foreign and vast. The kitchens fired their ovens in the deep dark of early morning. The stable hands were already moving by the time the sky turned gray, and the servant corridors, those narrow stone passages that ran behind the grand halls like veins behind skin, hummed with quiet, purposeful life long before any noble opened their eyes. Lyra had learned to love that hour. The palace belonged to the workers then. No one watched her. She dressed quickly in the cold of the lower quarters, fingers moving over buttons by feel in the dark, so as not to wake the 2 women sleeping in the cots beside hers. She pulled her dark hair back plain and tight, the way she wore it every day. She checked her hands out of habit clean, unscented, nothing to give her away, and then she went to find Marin. The senior housekeeper was already stationed at the assignment board when Lyra arrived, a cup of something steaming at her elbow and a face that suggested she had been awake since before time began and found it unremarkable. Marin was not a woman who greeted people. She simply began speaking when they entered her field of vision. "East wing," she said, not looking up. "Halls 5 through 9. You'll start at the far end and work toward the stair." Lyra went still for just a moment. The East wing. She had never been assigned there. "The East wing is shifter staff," she said. The East wing was shifter staff. Marin set down her cup. Bryn and Sorcha both declined the reassignment this morning. That said something. Bryn was not a woman who declined anything. She had been working Ashveil for 11 years and complained about none of it, not even the 3 flights of stairs to the upper gallery or the monthly deep clean of the council chamber's stone floors. "The nursery is in the East wing," Lyra said. "Halls 5 through 9? Marin repeated, which was her way of answering questions she didn't intend to engage with further. She picked up her cup again. "You'll need a secondary key. Don't lose it." Lyra took the key and didn't ask anything else. The palace corridors changed as she moved deeper into the East wing. The stone was older here, the walls thicker, the light from the sconce brackets warmer and more amber. The carpet runners were finer. The whole passage smelled of beeswax and wood smoke, and something underneath both, something wild and faint that clung to every surface, the particular scent of a shifter household that no amount of cleaning could fully remove. She had been told once that it wasn't unpleasant to human noses and that assessment was accurate. It smelled like cedar and cold air, like something living. The palace had been grieving for 18 months. You could feel it in the East wing more than anywhere else. The portraits along Hall 6 showed the late queen in summer colors, a woman with copper hair and a direct, unsentimental gaze. Someone had placed a small vase of winter flowers below the largest portrait. The flowers were fresh. Someone replaced them regularly. Lyra kept her eyes forward and her mop moving. She had heard the whispers, of course. Everyone in the palace had heard them, repeated and refined in the lower kitchens over meals, passed between staff the way bad news always traveled eagerly, with a kind of horrified relish. The pup couldn't shift properly. The heir. The king's only child. Born too soon, the story went. Born into grief, with his mother already gone before he drew his first breath. The partial shift had taken hold in the womb, they said, though no one below the rank of court healer actually knew what that meant. What they knew was what they had seen in glimpses. A small boy flickering between forms in the way that was not natural, not controlled. One ear shifted and one human. His left hind leg bent at an angle that made the more tender-hearted among the kitchen staff press their lips together and look away. The heir to the Ashveil throne, they whispered. And look at him. Lyra did not say what she thought about people who whispered that. She had learned not to say most of what she thought. She worked through halls 5 and 6 without incident. The corridor empty and quiet. The early morning light barely beginning to gray the windows. By hall 7, her rhythm was established, the particular economy of motion that experienced cleaners developed. The body moving on its own while the mind went somewhere quieter. She heard it before she reached hall 8. Crying. Faint. Muffled through a closed door, but unmistakable. The specific, exhausted sound of a child who had been crying for a while and had not yet been answered. Lyra stopped. The door at the end of the passage was closed. No light showed beneath it. The crying continued, thin and tired, the kind that came when a small person had already given up expecting anyone to come. She knew the rule. The nursery was not her assignment. She was East Wing halls only, and whatever was behind that door belonged to staff ranked well above her. Her mop was in her hand. Her key was for cleaning access only. She had survived 3 years in this palace by knowing exactly where her place was and staying inside it. Lyra stood at the end of the corridor and listened to the boy cry. Her hand tightened on the mop handle. Her feet did not move. She told herself it was not her place. From behind the door, the crying went quiet. The sudden, held breath quiet that was somehow worse than the sound itself. She walked away. She made it almost to the end of hall 8 before she stopped walking. Her hands already knew what she was going to do. They had known since hall 7. The rest of her had simply needed a moment to catch up. She turned around. She found him at the bottom of the east staircase. He was small, so much smaller than she had expected, though she couldn't have said what she had expected. Exactly the whispers in the kitchen made him sound like a problem, not a person. But he was very much a person. 3 years old and crumpled at the base of the last step. His small body caught somewhere between forms in the way she had heard about but never seen. One ear was a wolf pup's ear, silver-furred and pressed flat against his head. The other was a child's. His left leg was bent at the angle she recognized, the angle she had been trying not to think about since the day she first heard his name. He looked up at her with his father's gray eyes, wide and wet and furious. Lyra set down her bucket without thinking. She knelt. "All right," she said quietly. Not a question, not a performance of calm. Just a word that meant, "I see you, and I am not going anywhere." His chin wobbled. He was trying very hard not to cry again. She could see the effort of it in his jaw. This tiny heir to the most powerful wolf territory in the known world, refusing to be pitied by a maid he had never met. She respected that immediately. Her hands moved to him slowly, giving him time to object. When he didn't, she ran her fingers along the line of his leg light pressure. Practiced sequence, the assessment her father had taught her before she was old enough to name what she was learning. Nothing broken. The joint had twisted in the fall, but not displaced. The partial shift had locked his muscles in a pattern she knew how to ease, if she was careful. She was always careful. "Does this hurt?" she asked. He considered the question with great seriousness. "A little bit," he said. "I'm going to help with that." Her thumbs found the pressure points along his hip. the ones that interrupted the nerve signal keeping his shift locked mid-cycle. She worked quietly, not explaining, watching his face for the moment the tension released. It came after about 30 seconds. A slow exhale, his small shoulders dropping, the wolf's ear folding and then smoothing back into a child's. Both ears now, both sides. He looked down at himself with an expression of cautious surprise. "How did you do that?" he asked. "Trick I know," she said. She gathered him up, then one arm under his knees, one at his back, and stood. He was light, worryingly light for his age. She settled him against her hip and he did not protest, which told her more about how his morning had gone than any report could. The grand corridor stretched before her, long, high-ceilinged, lined with stone archways and the gray winter light of tall windows. The kind of corridor that made you aware of your own smallness. She was a human maid in a stained apron with the king's heir on her hip, and she had perhaps 40 yards to cover before she reached the east nursery passage. She started walking. Fenn's head settled against her shoulder. He smelled of cedar and warm wool, and something underneath both the clean, wild scent that all the shifter children had, like morning air before the palace woke. She focused on the far end of the corridor, on putting one foot in front of the other. She started humming. She hadn't planned to. It was simply what her hands remembered doing when they were occupied with something that needed soothing, a habit from years ago, from a different life, from a small room above a physician's workroom where she had learned that frightened things calmed faster with sound than with silence. The song was nothing. An old human lullaby, the kind with no particular words, just a melody that moved in circles. Fenn's breathing slowed. She did not look up. She did not look at the windows or the portraits or the high mezzanine gallery that ran above the corridor's midpoint. She kept her eyes forward and her footsteps even, and she carried the boy through the grand corridor of Ashveil Palace in her plain apron, singing under her breath, and she did not know that anyone was watching. Up on the mezzanine, the king stood at the railing and did not move. He had come from the council chambers. He had been walking with purpose toward the East Wing studies, a document in his hand that required his attention before the morning meeting. He had stopped because something below had made him stop, some pull he couldn't name, some shift in the quality of the air, and he had looked down over the railing and seen her. A human woman, small, dark-haired, his son on her hip and a song on her lips and her eyes fixed on the far end of the corridor with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly where she was going and intended to get there. No one carried Fenn like that. The court healers carried him carefully, the excessive, hovering careful, that was really just barely concealed discomfort. The nursemaids had carried him quickly, efficiently, getting the task done. The advisors didn't carry him at all. This woman carried his son the way you carried something precious. Something in Kaelin's chest. Something that had been sealed for 18 months, pressed down under grief and duty, and the daily machinery of a kingdom that needed its king functional, shifted, not much. The width of a breath. He stood at the railing long after she had rounded the corner and disappeared from sight. The document was still in his hand. He had forgotten it was there. The corridor was empty and quiet below. He turned and walked back the way he had come. He stopped at the first door, opened it, and looked at the aides stationed inside. "Find Marin," he said. "I want to know the name of the human maid assigned to the East Wing." Marin summoned her before she had finished returning her cleaning supplies to the lower stores. The message came through a junior maid, terse. No explanation. Just the housekeeper's name and the word now. Lyra set down her bucket, dried her hands on her apron, and went. The office smelled of dried lavender and old ledgers. Marin was standing, which was unusual. She stood with her hands clasped at her waist, and the particular set to her jaw that meant the conversation was already over before it began. "You've been reassigned," she said. "Permanent companion to the young prince, effective this afternoon. Your previous duties will be redistributed." Lyra went still. "I'm human," she said. "I'm aware. I have no training in royal nursery care, no formal credentials. There are shifter staff far better suited to." "There were," Marin said. They declined. She picked up the ledger on her desk and opened it, which was her way of indicating that the matter was settled, and Lyra's continued presence in the room was a courtesy she was choosing not to extend much longer. The appointment was made this morning by order of the king. Your quarters will be moved to the East Wing servants' rooms by evening. You'll take your meals from the nursery kitchen." Lyra stood very still and thought about all the reasons this was a disaster. The proximity. The daily, unavoidable proximity to a child whose condition her hands already knew how to treat. Every morning she spent in that nursery was a morning she would have to choose, again, between what she knew and what she was allowed to know. She had made that choice once already this morning. She was not naive enough to think it would be easier the second time, or the 100th. "Is there anything else?" Marin asked, not looking up. There was nothing else. There was nothing at all she could say. "No," Lyra said. "Thank you." The East Wing nursery was warm. That was the first thing she noticed. A fire already built up against the afternoon chill. The room amber-lit and smelling of the cedar oil rubbed into the wooden furniture and something sweeter underneath. The particular scent of a child's sleep. Fen was awake in his cot, sitting upright with the focused intensity of a small person engaged in private experiment. He was attempting to stack 3 wooden blocks. The third kept sliding off. He looked up when she entered. He assessed her with his father's gray eyes, serious, direct, giving nothing away for free. "You came back," he said. "I did." He considered this. Then he held out the 3rd wooden block. An offering, or a test, or possibly both. She sat on the edge of the cot and took the block and placed it carefully on top of the other 2. It stayed. Fen studied it with deep satisfaction. She did not hear the door. She only knew the king was there because Fen's eyes moved to the threshold and stayed, and the quality of the air in the room changed something about the weight of it, the particular stillness that powerful people carried with them like weather. She rose. Turned. He was taller than she had understood from glimpses across corridors. Broader. He wore no formal court dress, just dark riding clothes. No insignia. Nothing that announced him except the authority that lived in his posture like something structural, something load-bearing. His hair was dark with silver at the temples, and his jaw was exactly as tight as she would come to know it always was. His eyes found her immediately. Gray, not cold, exhausted. He did not come into the room. He stood in the doorway and looked at her with an expression she could not read, and she stood beside Fen's cot and looked back at him and waited. "You assessed his leg this morning," he said. "Before you carried him, I was told." She kept her face neutral. "I wanted to be sure nothing was broken before I moved him." "And you knew how to determine that?" It was not quite a question. Her pulse moved carefully behind her ribs. "Instinct," she said. Something shifted at the back of his eyes. He let it pass without pressing. Instead, he asked, very quietly, the question she had not expected. "Do you find his condition difficult to manage? Not, do you understand it? Not, are you qualified? Do you find it difficult?" "No," she said. And because she was constitutionally poor at performing answers she didn't believe, she added, "He's easy. He just wants someone who won't flinch at him." The silence afterward was very complete. Kaelin looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his son at Fen, who was watching his father with the held breath attention of a child who had learned not to expect much and was revising that assessment in real time. He said nothing. He stepped back from the doorway and left, his footsteps quiet down the corridor, and then the room breathed again. From the corner of her eye, Lyra noticed a figure pausing at the far end of the hall as the king passed Silver Blonde, impeccably still, watching. She didn't know him. She filed the face away. Fen tugged at her sleeve. "Will you stay?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I'll stay." He accepted this the way children accepted things that mattered without ceremony, just a small exhale, and then he pressed his warm weight against her side and went back to his blocks. That night, after Fen was asleep, Lyra sat in the low chair by his cot in the dying firelight and told herself she was only going to watch him breathe. She told herself she was not going to touch his leg. She told herself the slight tension in his hip, she could see it even in sleep. The way he lay at an angle that favored his left side, unconsciously accommodating a twist that had been there since before he was born, was not her concern. Her hands disagreed. She moved slowly, barely touching, finding the pressure point she had used on the staircase and holding it with the patience her father had taught her. Just enough. Just the edge of relief. Just keeping him comfortable. That was what she told herself, very quietly, in the back of her mind where the lies she needed to survive were kept. She knew she was already past it. 2 weeks passed. Fen slept through the night for the first time on the 4th day. Lyra sat in the low chair beside his cot and listened to his breathing slow and even, no catch in it, no restless turning, and told herself it meant nothing. Children slept better with consistency. Any nursemaid could tell you that. It was not the 20 minutes of careful work she did each night before he drifted off, her thumbs tracing the pathways her father had mapped across 40 years of practice. It was routine. It was simply routine. She told herself this with some conviction. By the end of the first week, his shifts were landing cleaner. Not perfectly, the left side still flickered, still lagged behind the right, but the episodes that had left him stranded and exhausted were coming less frequently. He moved more. He complained more, which she was fairly certain was a good sign. He had strong opinions about his breakfast, and stronger ones about which story she told at bedtime, and he expressed both with a directness that she found entirely reasonable. He was, she had decided, very good company. The king appeared on the 9th day, not inside the nursery, in the corridor outside it, which Lyra noticed because she noticed everything in the east wing, now every footstep, every pause, every shadow that moved under the door. He stood in the passage for perhaps 10 minutes. She heard no knock. He did not come in. She kept Fen occupied with a counting game, and her voice perfectly steady, and did not acknowledge the presence beyond the door in any way that she could later be questioned about. After that, he came most mornings. She grew fluent in the particular sound of him, the measured pace, the way he paused slightly longer outside the nursery than the corridor required. Once he came in the late afternoon and found her on the floor with Fen, rolling a wooden ball back and forth across the rug, and he stood in the doorway with an expression she had no name for, and watched for a long moment before he said, very formally, that she should address him as "Your Majesty Rat," her than "my lord" when speaking to him directly. She looked up at him. "I haven't addressed you as anything." "You will," he said. "When you do." She held his gaze for one beat longer than was strictly appropriate. "Of course, Your Majesty." He came back the next morning. The fire in the nursery had been freshly built. The room smelled of wood smoke and the particular cedar warmth that clung to all of Fen's things. And Lyra was reading from the illustrated book Fen had recently decided was the only acceptable bedtime text when she noticed the shadow beneath the door. Still, patient. She kept reading. She did not lower her voice or change her pace. The story was about a fox who kept getting lost in the same forest and kept finding, each time, something unexpected at the center of it. Fen had requested it 4 nights running. She was beginning to understand why. The shadow stayed until the story ended. She heard nothing after that. Just the fire settling, and Fen's sleepy weight against her side, and the ordinary nighttime sounds of a palace going quiet. She sat for a long time after he fell asleep and looked at the strip of dark beneath the door, and thought about a king who could not make himself go in. There were other watchers, less patient ones. She registered the court healers before they registered her. They had begun appearing at Fen's quarterly assessments with a particular quality of confusion in their faces, the expression of men who had written the same prognosis for 18 months and were now encountering evidence that complicated their paperwork. She gave them nothing. She described the improvements as dietary, as better sleep, as the natural variance in a young pup's development. They wrote it down with the discomfort of people who didn't quite believe it and couldn't prove otherwise. Somewhere beyond the nursery, in the part of the palace she was not permitted to see, someone was paying very close attention to those reports. She didn't know that yet, but she was beginning to feel it, a watchfulness in the peripheral spaces, the sense of a slow net being drawn in directions she couldn't quite track. She told herself she was imagining it. She was getting quite good at telling herself things. The question came on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks into her appointment. Kaelin had stayed longer than usual. Fen had demanded his father sit with them while Lyra read, employing the irresistible leverage of a 3-year-old who knew exactly what he wanted. and Kaelin had sat in the chair by the window with the rigid posture of a man deeply uncertain what to do with his own presence in a warm room. After Fen slept, she walked to the door. He was already there, standing, and the narrow space between the door and the window left them closer than the court ever would have permitted. "The staircase," he said. "3 weeks ago. You knew what to do." Her pulse moved carefully. "I told you." Instinct. His gray eyes were steady on her face. Cataloging. The jaw was tight, as it always was, but something beneath his expression was working, turning the answer over, testing its weight. "I don't believe that," he said. The words sat between them, quiet and absolute. She said nothing. She met his gaze and said nothing, and the fire had burned down to coals and the room was very still, and he looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who has found a door he doesn't yet have the key for. Then he stepped back, and nodded once, and left. He did not press further. Not yet. The fever came on fast. Lyra had seen it building through the afternoon. The slight glassiness in Fen's eyes, the way he pressed his face against her arm and didn't want to move, the warmth coming off his skin an hour before the shivers started. She had kept him calm, kept the room warm, kept her voice even. She had told herself it was an ordinary fever. Children ran fevers. It meant nothing. Then the shift cycle started, and it meant everything. It came in waves, his small body flickering between forms faster than she had ever seen it move, wolf and child and wolf again. The left side lagging and locking, and the pain of it waking him each time he nearly slipped into sleep. He was frightened. He was trying not to show it, which was somehow worse. She worked steadily, both hands, mapping the nerve pathways she knew by heart now, interrupting each cycle as it crested before it could lock. She did not think about what she was revealing. There was no room for that. There was only Fen. She heard the door. Kaelin came in without knocking. He would not have knocked. She understood that now. This was his son's room, and she was the maid, and he needed no permission, and he stopped when he saw them. Fen curled on the cot, feverish and flinching, her hands moving in the particular deliberate pattern that no amount of instinct could explain. He saw it. She knew he saw it. He crossed the room anyway and crouched on the other side of the cot, and he did not ask her a single question. "Tell me what to do," he said. So she told him. Keep his shoulders down during the cycle. Hold the warmth in with the blanket on the left side. Talk to him when he surfaces. It doesn't matter what you say, just let him hear your voice. Kaelin listened with the focused precision of a man who was very good in emergencies, and he did exactly what she said, and neither of them spoke of anything else. The hours passed in firelight and low voices. The fire burned down, and Kaelin rebuilt it without being asked. Fen surfaced and sank and surfaced again, reaching for whichever hand was closest without opening his eyes. Sometimes it was hers. Sometimes it was his father's. Kaelin held his son's hand in the dark with the careful grip of someone who had not allowed himself this before. And Lyra did not look at his face because she knew what she would see there and she could not afford it. Near the 4th hour, the cycles slowed. By the 5th, they stopped. Fen's breathing deepened real sleep. Finally, the kind with no catching in it, and the room went still. The fire was low. Through the narrow window above the cot, the sky had begun to pale at the very edges. Not dawn yet, the hour just before it, when the dark made one last effort, and the cold was at its deepest. Lyra sat back. Her shoulders ached. She became aware, slowly, that she had been holding herself rigid for hours, and that the release of that tension left her feeling hollowed out and warm all at once. Kaelin was still beside the cot, close. The small room and the long night had dissolved the careful distance he usually kept, and now he was near enough that she could see the line of exhaustion around his eyes, the tightness in his jaw gone slack for the first time since she had known him. He reached across. His hand moved without hurry, without announcement. He brushed the strand of hair from her face, tucked it back, his fingers grazing her temple, and then his hand stilled, not quite leaving, resting at the edge of her jaw. Neither of them moved. The fire breathed. Outside, something shifted in the early dark. "Lyra," he said. Just that. Her name, for the first time, in his voice. quiet as a question he hadn't decided to ask yet. She turned toward him. The distance between them was nothing. His eyes had dropped from hers to her mouth and stayed there, and she was aware of everything at once, the warmth of his hand still at her jaw, the pale gray of the pre-dawn light, the way he exhaled slowly, like a man setting something down after a long time carrying it. She was aware that she was going to let this happen. She was aware that she shouldn't. And then Fenn's hand found hers. Small fingers, sleep-warm, curling around her palm with the trusting completeness of a child who didn't know he was interrupting anything. He made a small sound and pressed closer without waking, and her hand closed around his automatically, the way it always did. Kaelin watched her do it. Something moved through his expression. Not loss, exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that looked like a man recognizing a truth he had been circling for weeks. He stood. He looked at her for one more moment. His son's hand in hers, the pale window, the dying fire. And then he walked to the door and left, and the latch clicked closed behind him, and the room held only the sound of Fenn sleeping. Lyra sat until the sky outside went from black to gray to the first thin gold of morning. She did not sleep. Across the palace, in the cold dark of his study, Kaelin sat at his desk with a document open in front of him. He had not read a word of it. His wolf, which had been silent for 18 months, pressed against the inside of his ribs with the patience of something that had been waiting a very long time. Mine, it said. Not a question. Not a warning. Just the truth, finally. Out in the open where he could no longer pretend he hadn't heard it. 3 days passed, and Kaelin did not come to the nursery. Lyra noticed on the first morning. The east corridor was quiet in the particular way. It was only quiet when he was absent, no measured footsteps, no shadow pausing beneath the door, no shift in the weight of the air. She told herself it was nothing. He was a king. Kings had mornings that did not involve standing outside their son's room watching a maid work. She noticed on the second morning, too, and the third Fenn noticed before she allowed herself to. He asked for his father at breakfast on the second day, in the direct way he asked for everything, and she told him his father had council business and that he would come when he could, and Fenn accepted this with the compressed patience of a child who had learned not to ask twice. She hated that he had learned that. She kept her face neutral and cut his bread into the small squares he preferred. The reports she sent through Marin came back acknowledged through Marin. No comment, no questions, nothing. She performed normalcy with precision. She was very good at performing normalcy. She had been doing it for 3 years, and the skills were all intact. The even voice, the occupied hands, the complete absence of any visible evidence that something had shifted in the past 72 hours. She was fine. Everything was routine. The space where warmth had briefly existed was simply space. That was all. On the 4th morning, Marin appeared in the nursery doorway just after breakfast. She had the ledger in her hand, which meant the visit was official. Lord Edric Vance presented a petition to the council yesterday, she said. He has requested the appointment of a qualified shifter healer to oversee the young prince's care, effective within the fortnight. She paused. The king has agreed to a formal review of current arrangements. The bread knife was in Lyra's hand. She set it down carefully. A review, she said. Standard procedure when concerns are raised through proper channels. Marin's voice was exactly what it always was, flat, efficient, a conveyor of information without editorial. But she held Lyra's gaze for 1 beat longer than she usually did. The reviewing healer will assess the prince's condition and the adequacy of his current care. They will want to observe his treatment directly. While her hands were working, while the pathways her father had mapped were moving under her thumbs in ways that no untrained maid had any business knowing. I see, Lyra said. Morin left. Fenn, from his corner of the room, looked up at Lyra with his father's gray eyes and the quiet attention of a child who understood more than adults credited him for. Are you going away? He asked. No, she said. And then, because she meant it, not if I can help it. She thought about Edric for the rest of the morning. She had been thinking about him at the edges of things for weeks. The silver-blonde figure at the corridor's end, the particular quality of his stillness, the fact that a man of his rank had any reason to notice a human maid at all. She had filed it and set it aside because she had other problems. Now she took it out and looked at it properly. A petition. Procedurally reasonable. Personally precise. Aimed at exactly the thing that could not be defended without revealing why it needed to be defended. Kaelin could not argue for her without showing the council what she meant to him. And she understood now, with a clarity that sat cold in her chest, exactly why he had stopped coming to the nursery. He was protecting her. The withdrawal that had felt like rejection was not rejection. It was a king doing the only quiet thing left available to him, trying to reduce the target. And it had not worked. Edric had moved anyway. She turned that over. Edric had moved anyway, which meant the petition was not about Kaelin's interest in her. It was about Fenn's improvement. It was about numbers in healer reports that no longer matched the narrative that had been 3 months in the building. She understood then what she was actually dealing with. Not a man who had noticed the king's attention. A man who had noticed the prince was getting better. The fire in the nursery had burned low. Fenn was asleep on his cot for his afternoon rest, one hand curled under his cheek, both ears human in the clean, easy way they had been for weeks now. She looked at him for a long moment. She had 2 choices. She could wait for the review, be exposed, and be removed quietly, procedurally, with nothing she could prove and no ground to fight from. Or she could find what Edric was actually doing with those healer reports before he had the chance to bury her under the paperwork he'd built. She was her father's daughter. Her father had believed that the right knowledge in the right hands was the only weapon that mattered. She had spent 3 years learning to be invisible in this palace. It was time to use it for something. She pulled her apron straight, checked that Fenn was sleeping soundly, and walked to the door. The East Wing corridors would be quiet at this hour. The archive rooms were 2 floors below the council chambers, accessible through the servant passages, staffed by a single clerk who took his afternoon tea at the same time every day without fail. She had noticed that months ago, the way she noticed everything. She had never thought she would need it. She needed it now. The archive room smelled of old paper and stone cold, and the particular dry stillness of a place that held things people had stopped looking at. Lyra had counted the clerk's tea break over 4 days before she used it. 14 minutes, twice daily, reliable as the palace bells. She slipped through the archive door during the afternoon break with a clean apron and an empty linen basket. A maid returning folded documents to storage, if anyone asked, and she moved fast and quiet between the shelves to the healer's record section she had located on her first visit the day E4. The ledgers were organized by year and subject. She found Fenn's file without difficulty. She opened it, and she read, and she understood within 3 pages what she was looking at. The entries were meticulous. Monthly assessments, each one signed by a different court healer, each one reporting marginal decline in the prince's shift stability, moderate worsening of the left side lag, limited prognosis for functional improvement. 18 months of careful, consistent, professionally worded deterioration. None of it matched the child she put to bed every night. She copied what she could onto the loose paper she had brought, hands steady, writing small. She had her father's handwriting precise and economical, the script of someone who had learned that information was worth protecting. She took the 3 most critical months, the ones where the gap between the written record and Fenn's actual condition was widest, and folded the copies into the lining of her apron. She was back in the East Wing before the clerk returned to his desk. That same evening, Kaelin came to the nursery. She heard him before she saw him, the particular quality of his footstep, the slight pause before the door. But this time he knocked. Once, quietly. She opened the door herself. He looked like a man who had been moving fast and stopped. His jaw was tight in the way she had learned, meant he was working through something that required careful management. He had a document in his hand. "Fenn?" he said first. "Asleep. He's been good today." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, and Lyra felt the change in the room, the way you felt a shift in weather, something closing in, something about to break. He looked at her for a moment in the low firelight, and then he said, "Edric's petition was not routine. My aide identified the timing against the healer report schedule. He moved the moment the improvement metrics became undeniable." "I know." she said. He looked at her. You know. She crossed to the small table by the window and spread her copied pages in front of him. She did not explain or preface. She simply let him read. The fire crackled softly. Fenn's breathing was slow and even in the cot across the room. She watched Kaelin's face as he read, watched the moment he understood what the columns were showing, the manufactured consistency of them. The 18 months of careful arithmetic designed to build a conclusion that had been decided before the first entry was written. His jaw went rigid. A muscle worked in his throat. He set the pages down. He has been telling me, Kaelin said very quietly, for 18 months, that my son would not improve. Yes. While falsifying the records to ensure I believed it. Yes. The word sat between them like something irreversible. Then he placed his own document on the table beside hers. She looked at it. Palace Archive letterhead, old ink, a name at the top that stopped her breath in her chest. Aldous, her father's name. In a palace execution record dated 16 years ago, her eyes moved down the page. The charge, unlicensed medical practice on royal grounds. The authorizing signature, Lord Brennan Vance, the king's senior counsel. Edric's predecessor, Edric's kin. She had known her father was executed. She had not known who signed it. She did not move for a long moment. My aide found it yesterday, Kaelin said. His voice was careful. Private. The voice she had only heard at close range, in the dark, with no rank between them. I came to tell you what it meant before anyone else could use it. She looked up at him. Your family has been suppressing healer knowledge in this palace for a generation, she said. Edric is not improvising. He is continuing something that was already in motion. Yes. He paused. I am sorry about your father. 4 words. Simple. Weighted with everything a king could not undo, and was not pretending he could. Her throat tightened. She looked back at the documents because she needed somewhere to put her eyes. She said, Fenn can walk the length of this room without assistance. He has been able to do it for 2 weeks. None of Edric's reports reflect that. She felt Kaelin go still beside her. Show me, he said. Tomorrow, she said, in front of everyone. The fire had burned very low. Outside the narrow window, the sky was full winter black, and the palace was quiet in the way it only went in the deepest part of the night. Fenn slept on in his cot, one hand curled open, his breathing the deep, rhythmic peace of a child who did not know the morning was coming. Kaelin reached across the table, not for the documents. His hand found hers, deliberately. Without any ambiguity about what it was or what it meant, she did not pull away. They stood like that in the dark beside the evidence of everything that had been done, and everything that still needed to be answered for. His hand warm over her calloused ones, neither of them speaking, until Fenn turned in his sleep and murmured something soft and wordless. Kaelin's hand released hers slowly. He looked at his son, then at her. In the morning, he said. In the morning, she agreed. He left, and Lyra stood alone in the nursery with her father's name on a piece of paper, and the warmth of the king's hand still printed on her skin, and she understood that by this time tomorrow, everything would be different. One way or another. The great hall had not been filled like this since the late Queen's funeral. Lyra could smell the tension before she saw the crowd, leather and steel, and the particular musk of wolves gathered in judgment. The court had assembled at dawn. No one had told her why. She was brought through a side entrance, no ceremony, Moren's hand firm on her elbow. The housekeeper's expression gave away nothing. The hall doors opened. Every head turned. Lyra's first thought was that the room was too bright. Morning light poured through the high windows, illuminating the noble houses arranged in their formal tiers, the council seated at the dais's base, and Kaelin standing at the center of the platform, gray eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not read. His wolf was present in him. She could see it in the tension of his shoulders, the stillness that meant his control was costing him something. Edric stood beside the king. His silver blonde hair gleamed in the light. His hands were empty except for a single sheaf of parchment. Lyra's pulse kicked hard against her ribs. The assembly recognizes Lord Edric Vance, the court herald announced. Edric inclined his head with perfect grace. His voice carried across the hall without effort. Your Majesty, honored council, I come before you with a matter of kingdom security that can no longer be delayed. He turned slightly, and his gaze settled on Lyra with something that looked almost like regret. The woman standing before you has served in this palace for 2 years, under the name Lyra, employed as domestic staff through standard labor agreement. She was recently elevated to the position of the Crown Prince's primary caretaker, a decision made without full knowledge of her background. The murmuring started low. Kaelin did not move. Edric continued. 6 weeks ago, irregularities in Prince Fenn's treatment schedule prompted me to investigate the woman responsible for his care. What I discovered is a lineage this court believed extinct. Lyra is the illegitimate daughter of Aldous, the human physician executed by the late King Aldrich for practicing unlicensed healing arts on royal grounds. She has concealed her heritage and her training. She has applied that training to the Crown Prince without authorization, without oversight, and in direct violation of the law that ended her father's life. The murmuring became noise. Lyra's hands were steady at her sides. She did not look away from Edric. The charge, Edric said quietly, is unauthorized medical intervention on the heir to the Ashveil throne. The concern is motivation. We do not know why she sought this position. We do not know what she intended to achieve. What we do know is that she has spent 2 years hiding who she is, and 6 weeks alone with a vulnerable child whose condition affects succession. A voice from the council benches called out, "Has the prince been harmed?" Edric's pause was perfectly timed. The prince's condition remains unchanged. Lord Garrett's last 3 reports confirm no improvement in mobility or shift stability. The question is not harm, it is intent. Why conceal her training if her purpose was benign? Lyra felt the trap close. If Fenn had not improved, she was incompetent. If he had, the reports were lies, and Edric controlled the reports. Kaelin's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Lyra. She met his eyes. The wolf behind them was a living thing. Did you conceal your heritage? Yes. Did you treat my son without authorization? Her throat tightened. The hall erupted. Kaelin raised one hand, and silence fell like a stone. Why? Lyra's voice was steady. She had practiced this answer for 2 years, and it had never mattered until now. Because the law killed my father for the crime of healing, because I am good at what he taught me, because your son needed someone who saw him as more than a problem to be managed. Edric's expression did not change. A compelling answer. But the assembly requires more than testimony. He gestured to the council scribe. I have documentation, Aldis's execution record, witness accounts of his work, and 18 months of Prince Fenn's medical evaluations, all of which indicate a child whose condition has not responded to intervention. Lyra's pulse was a drum in her ears. She looked at Kaelin. His jaw was tight. His hands were fists at his sides. She took one breath, then another. Bring Fenn into the hall. The silence was immediate and total. Edric turned to her, and for the first time his composure cracked. Absolutely not. The prince is not a spectacle for— Bring my son, Kaelin said. His voice was quiet. It carried like thunder. Edric's smile was gone. Your Majesty, I must object. The child should not be subjected to, now. The command was absolute. Senna moved from her place at the dais' edge, her expression unreadable, and disappeared through the rear corridor. The hall waited. Lyra could hear her own heartbeat. She could smell the wolves around her, their attention a living weight. She did not look at Edric. She looked at Kaelin, and his eyes held hers with something that felt like a promise or a threat, or both. The rear doors opened. Fenn walked in, not carried, not supported. Walking, both legs steady beneath him, his gait clean and even, his small shoulders straight. He crossed the space between the door and the dais with the particular focus of a child who knew every eye in the room was on him and was determined not to falter. 20 steps. 30. His left leg held. The hall had gone so silent, Myra could hear the rustle of his shirt. Fen reached the base of the dais and looked up at his father. His gray eyes were bright. "Papa?" Kalen's expression broke. He came down the steps in 3 strides, dropped to his knees, and pulled his son against his chest. Fen's small arms came up around his neck. The king buried his face in his son's hair, and for a moment the most powerful wolf in the kingdom was just a man holding a child he had been told to mourn. Lyra's vision blurred. Kalen stood, Fen still in his arms, and turned to face the assembly. His voice was raw. "Lord Edric, you have 18 months of reports documenting my son's lack of progress. I am holding the evidence that every single one of them was a lie." Fen twisted in his father's arms and reached for Lyra. His small hands opened and closed in the universal demand of a child who knew exactly where he wanted to be. Kalen's grip tightened for a fraction of a second, then released. The boy scrambled down and crossed the remaining distance between them on legs that no longer shook. Lyra dropped to her knees. Fen collided with her chest and wrapped his arms around her neck with the ferocity of someone who had been separated too long. She held him. Her throat closed. The hall watched in absolute silence. Kalen's voice carried across the space like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. "Lord Edric, you have documentation. So do I." He gestured. Senna stepped forward from the shadows at the dais's edge, a leather-bound ledger in her hands. She placed it on the council table without ceremony. "My aide brought this to my attention 3 days ago," Kalen said. 18 months of healer reports signed by Lord Garrett. 18 months of parallel payments from an account controlled by Lord Edric to Lord Garrett's personal holdings. Payments that began the week after my mate's death and continued through last month. The murmuring started again, lower now, dangerous. Edric's composure was still intact, but something had shifted in his stillness. "Your Majesty, correlation is not evidence of... The reports document progressive deterioration in my son's condition," Kalen continued. His voice was quiet. It filled every corner of the hall. "They recommend reducing his physical activity. They advise against intervention. They conclude that his condition is likely permanent and will worsen with age." He paused. "My son just walked 37 steps without assistance. Which part of the documentation would you like to defend first?" Edric's jaw tightened. "Medical assessment is not an exact science. Lord Garrett may have been overly cautious in his..." "Lord Garrett fled the capital 2 nights ago," Senna said. Her tone was factual, cold. Palace guard found his residence empty. His records were not. She placed a second folder on the table. The council scribe opened it. His expression went very still. "Draft reports," Senna continued. "Unsigned. Dated 4 weeks in advance. Instructions for specific language to be used in assessments not yet conducted. All in Lord Edric's hand." The room erupted. Edric did not move. His silver blonde hair gleamed in the morning light, his posture perfect, his hands loose at his sides. He looked like a man carved from marble, beautiful, cold, and utterly unmoved by the noise rising around him. Kalen descended the dais steps. The hall fell silent again. "You used my grief," he said quietly. "You used my son. You manufactured 18 months of evidence to justify removing him from succession so your bloodline could rise in his place." Edric met his eyes. "I acted in the kingdom's best interest. A weak heir endangers." "My son is not weak." Kalen's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "You are." He raised one hand. Palace guard materialized from the hall's perimeter, their movements precise and utterly silent. They flanked Edric on both sides. "Remove him," Kalen said. "Pending full investigation, he does not leave the palace grounds." Edric's composure finally cracked. His gaze swept the council, searching for allies, and found none. The numbers were visible now, laid out on the table where trust used to be. He had spent 18 months building a case no one could refute, and in 3 minutes it had collapsed under the weight of a child's steady gait. The guards moved. Edric did not resist. He walked from the hall with his head high and his hands empty, and the doors closed behind him with a sound like a crypt ceiling. Lyra's arms tightened around Fen. The boy's heartbeat was steady against her chest. Kaelin crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, this human woman on her knees with his son in her arms, her dark hair falling loose from its pins, her brown eyes steady and exhausted, and entirely unafraid. His wolf was a living presence in him now, fully awake, straining against his skin with a need that had nothing to do with control. He spoke to the assembly without looking away from her. Lyra's father was executed for the crime of healing without license. The law that killed him was written by men who feared what they could not command. I am rewriting it. His voice softened. She gave my son his future. She asked for nothing. She hid because survival required it. And his throat worked. I failed to see her until she made it impossible not to. He dropped to one knee. The hall inhaled as one. Lyra, he said. Just her name, her whole name, spoken like a vow. She looked at him. His gray eyes were no longer exhausted. They were burning. I claim you, he said, before this court, before every noble house in this kingdom, before my son, who you carried when I could not. I claim you as mate, as queen, as the woman who taught me that strength is measured by what we protect, not what we command. His wolf surged. She felt it in the air between them, heat and pine, and the electric charge of a bond that had been straining for weeks and would not be denied any longer. Lyra's voice was steady. I accept. The bond snapped into place. Not completely, not yet, but the first thread pulled taut between them, undeniable and absolute, and Kaelin's control shattered. He stood, pulled her to her feet, and the hall erupted again, this time with something that sounded almost like relief. Senna appeared at Lyra's elbow. There's an antechamber, she murmured. Private. The prince can wait with me. Fen looked up at Lyra. His gray eyes were solemn. You're coming back? She touched his cheek. I promise. He let Senna take his hand. The woman led him toward a side door, her expression carefully neutral, and Lyra felt Kaelin's hand close around her wrist, warm, steady, trembling slightly with the force of what he was holding back. They were given the antechamber. The door closed. Kaelin turned her to face him, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that belied the wildness in his eyes. I need. His voice broke. Lyra, I know, she whispered. He kissed her, not gently, not carefully. His mouth was heat and hunger, and 18 months of grief finally breaking open into something that felt like hope. She kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer, and his wolf roared approval as the bond between them flared bright and absolute. He pulled back just enough to breathe, his forehead pressed against hers. The claim, he murmured. I have to, yes. He tilted her head to the side, baring her throat, and his canines lengthened as his wolf surged forward one final time. The bite was swift and sure. A flash of pain followed by a wave of sensation so overwhelming she gasped against his shoulder. The taste of copper and magic flooded the bond between them, sealing it, completing it, binding them in a way that no court assembly or royal decree could ever replicate. When he pulled back, his eyes had gone amber. His wolf looked at her through them, satisfied and fierce and utterly, irrevocably hers. Mine, he whispered. Yours, she answered. They stood there in the quiet aftermath, her pulse slowing, his breathing evening out, the bond between them settling into something that felt less like lightning and more like bedrock. When they finally opened the door, Fen was waiting with Senna, his small face serious and watchful. Kaelin held out one hand to his son. Lyra held out the other. Fen took both, his grip firm and confident, and together the three of them walked back through the great hall, past the nobles who had judged her, past the council that had tried to erase her, past the empty space where Edric had stood and lied for 18 months. 3 people walking out where one had walked in, and the court that had tried to make her invisible watched every single step. 1 year later, Fen ran through the gardens on his 4th birthday morning, and for the first time in his life, no one followed close enough to catch him if he fell. His gait was still uneven. His left leg still turned slightly inward when he shifted, and his wolf form flickered at the edges like a candle in wind. But he ran. He laughed. He stumbled once, caught himself, and kept going, without looking back to see if anyone had noticed. Lyra watched from the palace steps, her hand resting on the curve of her belly where their daughter grew. 6 months along. A girl with a heartbeat like thunder and a restlessness that kept Lyra awake at night in the best possible way. Kalen stood beside her, his shoulder pressed against hers, warm in the morning sun. The silver at his temples had spread slightly. The tightness in his jaw had eased. He looked like a man who had learned to breathe again. The palace had changed. Human staff no longer wore separate aprons or entered through different doors. Lyra's first act as queen had been to establish a formal healer training program open to any lineage, human or shifter, who wanted to learn the old bone-setting arts her father had died protecting. The second act had been smaller. She'd requested Marin be given a seat on the household council. The housekeeper had accepted with her usual efficiency and no visible emotion, but Lyra had seen her hands shake slightly when she signed the appointment document. Edric's trial had taken 3 months. The evidence Senna uncovered went deeper than falsified medical reports. 18 months of systematic manipulation, payments to silence dissent, and a collateral inheritance clause written in language so precise it could only have been designed to exploit a grieving king's blind spots. He was exiled to the northern border territories under permanent guard. His bloodline's claim to succession was formally nullified. The council had been restructured. Oversight was no longer optional. Fenn's laughter carried across the garden. He was chasing a butterfly with the single-minded determination of a child who had spent too long being told to move carefully and had decided that careful was boring. Kalen's voice was quiet. I used to watch him and see only what was missing. Lyra turned to look at him. His gray eyes were fixed on his son. I catalogued every stumble, he continued, every shift that didn't complete. Every time he couldn't keep up with the other children, I measured him against an image of what he should have been and mourned the difference. His throat worked. You taught me to stop mourning. She laced her fingers through his. You taught yourself. I just carried him until you remembered how. He pulled her closer. The bond between them hummed steady, unshakable, warm as sunlight on stone. She had lived 2 years invisible in this palace. She had spent 6 weeks falling in love with a king who didn't know how to be gentle. She had stood in front of his entire court and asked a child to walk. She was his mate now, his queen. The woman who had rewritten the law that killed her father and used it to build something better. Fenn shouted from across the garden. Papa, Lyra, come run! Kalen looked at her. His mouth curved, not the controlled expression he wore for court, but something real and unguarded and entirely hers. Shall we? She smiled. He'll outpace us both. Good. They crossed the garden together, Kalen's hand warm in hers, their daughter kicking once against her ribs as if impatient to join them. Fenn grabbed both their hands when they reached him, his small fingers strong and certain, and pulled them forward into the morning light. They ran. Thank you for listening to The Weight of Small Things. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're hungry for more tales of fated mates, hidden magic, and love that rewrites kingdoms, there's another story waiting for you right here on the channel. Until next time, may you always find the strength to carry what matters most.